It seems most photographers completely ignore the existence of the Preferences dialog box in Lightroom until they're already somewhat deeply involved in managing their images. That's actually not a problem because the default settings are fine for most users, and in most cases the settings found in Preferences are just that, personal preferences that aren't critical to your workflow. In this lesson, I'll provide you with an overview of the options found in the General Preferences, focusing on the settings that are most important to consider. To get started with Preferences, you'll want to choose Edit Preferences from the menu on Windows or Lightroom Preferences on the Macintosh. This will bring up the Preferences dialog box, defaulting to the General tab. The first couple settings are quite self-explanatory and not terribly critical. Obviously, the language is easy to understand. You'll want to choose the language that's most appropriate to you personally. Note that if you do change the language, it won't be reflected in Lightroom until you actually restart Lightroom. Below that, you'll find a checkbox that you can turn off if you don't want to see the splash screen during startup. Obviously, this is not a particularly critical setting, but if you find it annoying that the splash screen appears, you can certainly turn it off. I do recommend keeping the Automatically Check for Updates checkbox turned on. By leaving this option turned on, Lightroom will periodically check to see if new updates to the software are available, and when they are, you will be notified that it's ready to download and install. This helps to make sure that you're working with the latest version of Lightroom, including any bug fixes that may have been taken care of along the way. The next option allows you to determine which catalog should be opened when you first launch Lightroom. By default, whichever catalog you most recently were working with will be opened again. For most users, this probably makes sense. In fact, many users only use a single catalog within Lightroom. You do have other options, though, which are particularly important if you're working with more than one catalog. If you choose the Prompt Me When Starting Lightroom option, every time you start Lightroom, you'll be asked which catalog you'd like to open. You can also choose a specific catalog from the list of recently opened catalogs. If you choose a catalog from this section of the list, that catalog will always be opened whenever you launch Lightroom, regardless of which catalog you had been using previously. You can also choose Other if you'd like to choose a specific catalog that is not on this list. In other words, a catalog you've saved elsewhere on your computer that has not yet been opened in Lightroom. In the next section, we have options related to importing your images into Lightroom. The first checkbox, which is turned on by default, will cause the import dialog to appear anytime a memory card is inserted into a card reader or otherwise made available in the computer. While this can certainly be convenient and is helpful in making sure that you remember to import all of your images into Lightroom, I tend to find it rather annoying. So I prefer to turn this option off. I just need to remember then to choose the import option explicitly when I want to bring new images into Lightroom. The next option allows you to ignore camera-generated folder names when you're renaming folders upon import into Lightroom. For most cameras, this is not an issue, but if your camera generates multiple folders when you capture images, this can create problems in terms of the naming of the folders that you import. We recommend leaving this option turned on, which will streamline the folder naming process upon import. We also have the option to treat JPEG files next to RAW files as separate photos. This is applicable for photographers who capture in the RAW plus JPEG mode, so that each image is effectively saved twice, once as the original RAW capture and again as a JPEG image rendered by the camera. In most cases, we prefer to have this option turned off, so that you'll only see a single image for each of your captures. However, in certain circumstances, you might want this turned on, in situations where you want to be able to see the way the camera rendered that file. This is important for photographers who use custom settings inside the camera, since those settings don't affect the actual RAW capture. In the next section, you have the option to set completion sounds for both when images are finished importing and when they're finished exporting. These are based on the sounds available in your operating system and are purely a matter of personal preference. In the next section, there's a single button to reset all warning dialogues. In various places throughout Lightroom, you may come across error messages that include a checkbox allowing you to turn off that error message so that it will not be presented in the future. If you decide you want those error messages to be shown again, you can click the Reset All Warning Dialogues button. The only caveat here is that you can't choose individual error messages that you want to have displayed. When you click Reset, all warning dialogues will be presented again, so any of those you don't want to see, You'll need to turn on that checkbox so they're not shown again. Finally, we have the Catalog Settings. This includes a button to take us to the Catalog Settings dialog box, which is covered in a separate lesson. As you can see, the general settings and preferences are very straightforward, and for the most part are simply a matter of personal preference. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the preferences for presets in Lightroom. The Preferences dialog is accessible by choosing Edit Preferences from the menu in Windows or by choosing Lightroom Preferences on Macintosh. Then click the Presets tab to review the settings related to presets. At the top of the dialog box, you'll find a set of checkboxes related to the Develop module. The first checkbox allows you to apply auto tone adjustments. In the Develop module, you can have tonal adjustments applied automatically by Lightroom. We suggest leaving this option turned off and instead evaluating for yourself on an image-by-image basis whether the auto or other customized tonal adjustments will work best. The next checkbox allows you to determine whether you want an automatic mix of the various channels when producing a black and white interpretation of your image. We like leaving this option turned on because it generally gives us a good starting for a black and white image. The next two options relate to specific settings related to either a particular camera or a camera ISO setting. If you turn on the option to make your defaults specific to camera serial numbers, any settings that you set as defaults will relate only to the current camera serial number based on the image you're currently working on. That can be useful for situations where you're using more than one camera and you want different settings applied to each of those. For example, oftentimes wedding photographers will be using two cameras, one designated for color images and the other designated for black and white images. You could then apply settings individually to the images captured with each camera by designating those defaults based on the camera serial number. The next option is similar, except in this case it relates to a specific camera ISO setting, not a particular serial number of camera. In other words, it will set specific defaults related to the ISO used for the capture regardless of which camera was used. This is helpful for situations where you want to apply higher levels of noise reduction, for example, to images that were captured at a higher ISO setting. Similarly, you could use lower settings or even not apply noise reduction at all for images that were captured at a particularly low ISO setting. Finally, we have the option to reset all developed settings to their original values. Simply click this button and all defaults will be reset. You don't have the option to pick and choose which specific settings will be reset to their defaults. By default, the presets are stored in a specific location that is global to all users on the computer and to all catalogs within Lightroom. If you prefer, you can turn on this option to store the presets with the catalog specifically so that they'll be stored in the same location. This does make it easier if you need to transport a catalog to a different computer and want to take those presets with you. But in most cases, we prefer to keep the presets on the computer in the general location so that they're accessible to all users within all catalogs. The next section contains 7 buttons, each of which allows you to restore specific presets for particular settings within Lightroom. As you can see, these relate to the export presets, file name templates, local adjustment presets, and others. In short, if you've made adjustments to the presets in Lightroom and you'd like to get them back to the way they originally were when you first installed Lightroom, click the appropriate button here. That covers the relatively short list of options related to the use of presets in Lightroom. External editing refers to the use of software other than Lightroom to apply changes to images that are being managed by Lightroom. For most photographers, this of course means using Photoshop in conjunction with Lightroom. In this lesson, we'll explore the Lightroom preferences related to the use of an external editor. The Preferences dialog box is accessible by choosing Edit Preferences in Windows or Lightroom Preferences on Macintosh. Then click the External Editing tab and you're ready to fine-tune these settings as needed. The top section of the external editing page relates to the use of Photoshop specifically in conjunction with Lightroom. We recommend that these options be left to their default values unless you have a good reason to change any of these settings. For file format, your options are TIFF versus PSD, and quite frankly, there's really no strong reason for choosing one over the other. We just leave this set to the TIFF file format. The color space setting should be left set to ProPhoto RGB in most cases. This is the largest color space of those available and the color space that Lightroom uses in its own processing of your images. If you have an important reason to use Adobe RGB or sRGB, that's fine, but otherwise we suggest leaving it set to ProPhoto RGB. Bit depth should always be left at 16 bits per component, again unless there's a reason that you need to produce smaller file sizes. For example, if you are producing a composite panorama consisting of multiple images, you might want to work at a lower bit depth just to reduce the file size that you're dealing with. Otherwise, keep this set to 16 bits per component. The resolution is primarily a convenience factor. This relates only to the setting within the image, not the actual number or layout of pixels within that image. In other words, you're not doing any harm to the image by changing this value. If you're printing primarily to a photo inkjet printer, for example, you might want to use a resolution of 360 pixels per inch. Regardless, whatever setting you typically use for output, you may want to set it here purely for convenience. Finally, we have the option for compression. We can choose between none or zip compression. Zip compression is lossless, and it will reduce the file sizes that Lightroom and Photoshop are dealing with, so we recommend keeping this set to zip. The next section relates to the use of an external editor other than Photoshop. For example, you might be using Photoshop Elements or an entirely different application for optimizing your images. The first setting here is for a preset. Once you've established specific settings, you'll want to save those settings as a new preset to make it easier to get back to those settings if, for example, you were to work with multiple external editors. The most important setting in this section, of course, is the actual application to be used. Simply click the Choose button and navigate to the location where the application is installed and choose the application itself. The remaining settings here relate to those that we've seen above. The file format options are the same, TIFF versus PSD, and the color space options are also the same. Notice that here it's defaulted to sRGB. The reason you might want to choose sRGB or Adobe RGB is that many applications won't work well with ProPhoto RGB files. Given the option, we'd prefer to work with ProPhoto RGB, but that can be problematic, especially for applications that do not support 16-bit images. In those cases, we would recommend using sRGB or potentially Adobe RGB. The specific settings that are going to be ideal depend in large part on the specific software you're using, so you'll want to check into the capabilities of that software before establishing these settings. For bit depth, again, this relates to the capabilities of the software you're using. We recommend using 16 bits, but in many cases the software will not support that, so if your software does not support 16-bit, you won't have any choice. The setting is purely a matter of convenience and isn't going to cause any problems regardless of which software you're using. And finally, for compression, we have an additional option available. Besides none and zip, we can also use LZW compression. This actually would be our preference in any event, and so we would leave that set to the default value. The only issue you might run into, although it's become exceedingly rare these days, is software that does not support LZW compression. If that's the case, chances are the software doesn't support zip compression either, in which case you'll need to use none. Finally, we have the option to change the file naming structure for images that are edited outside of Lightroom. As you can see, this is template-based. We can click and choose a template if we had created any, or click the Edit button to bring up the File Name Template Editor. Here we can specify a file naming structure that we'd like to use. The file name structure is created in this text box. Essentially, we can type new values or insert existing fields that are available. In this case, for example, you can see that the new file name will be the existing file name plus a dash and the word edit. We can change this by typing new values, deleting existing fields, or choosing specific fields we'd like to add. For example, if you'd like a sequence number or date inserted as part of the file name structure, you can choose the appropriate value from the pop-up. In this case, I was happy with the file naming structure the way it was, so I'll simply click the Cancel button to get back to my original settings. The settings in the external editing section of the Preferences dialog are very important if you're using software outside of Lightroom to optimize your images. Be sure to check these settings if you'll be working with your images using any other software. You can certainly appreciate that Lightroom deals with a great many files, and you naturally have a variety of options related to how those files are dealt with. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the preferences related to file handling. The Preferences dialog is accessible by choosing Edit Preferences in Windows or Lightroom Preferences on Macintosh. To get to the file handling settings, simply click the tab labeled File Handling. The first section in the File Handling tab relates to the creation of DNG files upon import. If you choose to convert your images to the DNG, the digital negative format, upon import, these settings will apply. The first is a file extension, which frankly is not a critical setting. This simply relates to whether the file extension will be all lowercase or all uppercase. The compatibility option should generally be left to the most recent version of Camera Raw. If your workflow depends upon images that were converted with a previous version of Camera Raw, for example from previous versions of Lightroom, then you may need to choose one of these other options. But for most users, that will not be necessary. The JPEG preview option relates to the size of the preview that gets embedded inside of your DNG file so that it can be viewed more quickly in a variety of applications, including Lightroom. The options are for no JPEG preview, in which case the preview needs to be rendered on the fly, a medium-size preview, or a full-size preview which would be compressed with JPEG compression. We consider the medium-size option to be a good compromise between the size of the JPEG image that's being added to your DNG file and the overall image quality. Finally, you have the option to embed the original RAW file in your DNG file. While we recommend keeping your original RAW file so you can always go back to it, even if you're using the DNG file as your primary file in terms of your image workflow, we do recommend embedding that RAW file as part of the DNG so that you can always return to it through the DNG later if needed. The next two checkboxes relate to the use of hierarchical keywords. If you're using hierarchical keywords in Lightroom, the default is to use the vertical bar symbol, which is often referred to as the pipe symbol, to separate hierarchical keywords. You can also enable support for the period or slash key as a keyword separator by turning on either or both of these checkboxes. This would be important if you had previously established hierarchical keywords for your images using other software that used one of these characters rather than the vertical bar symbol to separate the hierarchical keywords. The file name generation section, of course, deals with file names for your images. This relates both to files that are being imported into Lightroom as well as file names you're creating through a variety of methods within Lightroom. The first option determines which characters will be considered illegal. In other words, which characters are not allowed to be part of file names. This is important because all operating systems have a set of certain special characters that are not allowed to be used in file names. To play it safe, it's best to choose the option that contains the maximum number of characters that will not be allowed. You can then determine what you want any existing illegal characters to be replaced with. The options are a dash or an underscore character. You can also choose to replace any illegal characters with similar characters, but this is a little bit of a guessing game, and so we recommend using either the underscore or the dash. You can also determine whether file names should be changed if they contain a space. In certain situations, you'll find that applications have a problem with file names that contain spaces. The default is to leave the file names as they are, including spaces, but if you prefer, you can also replace them with either an underscore or a dash. In most cases, you're not likely to run into any problems here, but there is still some software out there that doesn't support spaces in file names. Generally speaking, you can leave this set to the Leave As Is option unless you run into a problem with particular software. The cache for Camera Raw is where the previews are stored for the Develop module. This is separate from the cache that's stored as part of the catalog containing the previews and thumbnails for your images. You can choose a specific location for your cache, for example, placing it onto a particularly fast hard drive if you have more than one hard drive installed in your computer. In most cases, leaving it to the default is just fine. You also have the option to increase the size of your cache. The minimum size is 1 GB and the maximum size is 200 GB. A larger cache allows more previews to be available inside the Develop module, which means that you'll be able to see previews more quickly as you go from one image to the next. In general, if you have plenty of available hard drive space, it's a very good idea in terms of overall system performance, specifically responsiveness in the Develop module when you're switching images, to increase this value. Use a setting that's appropriate based on how much available space you have and how likely you are to consume that hard drive space with other files. For example, if you keep all of your images on an external hard drive, then you can probably use up most of the available space on the internal hard drive in your computer. We also have the option here to purge the cache. In most cases, this should not be necessary. In fact, it's really only necessary if there's corruption of your cache. which would be exhibited by problems with the previews in the Develop module. It can also be beneficial in certain situations where you're going to be working on a large project and you want the cache only to contain the images for that project. In such a situation, you could purge the cache before starting on such a project to clear out the cache of all images that had been previously worked on. While the default settings for file handling will work well for most users, some of the settings can be very important to properly dealing with your images and the metadata contained within them. While some of the options found throughout the Preferences dialog are very important to your workflow, those found on the Interface tab are truly a matter of personal preference. While that means the particular settings aren't critical to a successful workflow, making changes to some of the settings here can make a big impact on your experience using Lightroom. To take a look at the interface settings, choose Edit Preferences on Windows or Lightroom Preferences on Macintosh, and then click the Interface tab. The top section relates to the panels that you see on either side of the Lightroom interface. End marks determines which symbol will be visible to indicate the bottom of a panel. You can see the default flourish over here on the right panel in Lightroom. You can change this to any of a number of symbols. Unfortunately, a preview is not shown here, so you would need to change the symbol in order to see what it looks like. But obviously, this is not exactly the most important setting to consider in Lightroom. The font size setting can be quite important, especially if you're running your monitor at a particularly high resolution or you're having difficulty seeing small fonts. There are only two settings here that actually change the font size, small and large. Automatic will simply cause Lightroom to automatically establish the setting for the font size. In most cases, I would recommend using the small option because it allows you to see more information at any given time. However, if it's difficult to read, there's no sense in straining your eyes, simply choose the large option. Note that changes made to the font size setting will not take effect until you restart Lightroom. The next section relates to the Lights Out feature. This is a feature that allows you to focus your attention more clearly on the image based on the way the display is changed. There are two levels of Lights Out. One is dim, where the image is shown at full intensity, but the controls outside of the image are shown at a dimmer setting. The other setting is full Lights Out, where you can only see the image and nothing else around it. This can be a great way to evaluate the image. You have the option of what screen color you want to use for the Lights Out display. In other words, what color will appear around the outside of the image. The default is black, and that's arguably the best setting to use because it's going to take away less from the image. For a computer display, black means don't show anything, and that means around the image you'll see nothing except the image itself. You can use a lighter shade of gray or even white if you prefer, but you might want to give that some thought and consider sticking with black as the best choice. To the right of this, you'll find the dim level option. As I said, there are two levels for the Lights Out display. The dim level setting determines how opaque the screen color will be. The default is 80%, but you can also choose 90%, 70%, or 50%. This just determines the extent to which you'll be able to see the other controls, for example on the panels, when you're using the dimmed version of the Lights Out display. In the background section, we can determine which color you'd like to use for the background within Lightroom. There are available options for the main window, in other words the primary Lightroom display that you would typically have up on your primary monitor, and a secondary window which you would typically display on a second monitor if you had more than one display. The fill color, as the name implies, determines the actual color of the background. The default is medium gray, but you can also choose a different shade of gray or white or black. We find that medium gray provides a good balance in terms of not influencing the overall tonality of your images. But again, if you prefer a different shade of gray, you can certainly choose one of those options. You also have an option for texture, but we recommend leaving the set to none. Quite frankly, the pinstripes texture is just distracting, and we don't see any benefit in using that option. The keyword entry section, of course, relates to the entry of keywords in Lightroom. When you're typing keywords for your images, you have an option as to whether you want keywords to be separated using commas or spaces. This may seem like a silly consideration, but it actually can be quite important depending on the way you look at keywords. If you use commas to separate keywords, then you're allowed to use spaces as part of the keyword. For example, you could have a person's first and last name as a single keyword, which makes it a little bit easier to search for that person's complete name later. If, on the other hand, you choose to separate keywords with spaces, then by definition a space determines a separator between those keywords, and therefore a person's first and last name, for example, would be considered different keywords. We generally consider it a good thing to be able to use spaces in keywords, and so we prefer the commas option. Also for keywords, we have the option to automatically complete the text you're typing in the keyword tags field. If you prefer not to have the auto-completion turned on, simply clear the checkbox. In most cases, however, since the keyword tags that it would automatically complete are based on keyword tags you've already typed, this is a good option for most users. The film strip allows you to always be able to get a look at the currently available images, and so in many cases it's very helpful to have additional information displayed with the thumbnails on the film strip. The checkboxes in the film strip section allow you to determine which information will be visible with those film strip images. As you can see, we can choose things such as whether or not we want ratings and pick status to be displayed, whether we want badges that indicate such things as whether or not adjustments have been applied to an image, an indication of how many images are contained in a stack if you're using stacks, and also whether or not the navigator will show a preview of any image as you mouse over it. Finally, you have the option as to whether or not you want to show photo info, in other words, some metadata about a particular image when you mouse over an image. We find that the tooltips with photo info can be distracting, especially when they only appear because we inadvertently left the mouse pointer hovered over one of the thumbnails on the film strip. Finally, we have the tweaks section. The first checkbox determines the behavior of the zoom tool. In other words, if you click with the zoom tool on an image, do you want the image to simply zoom without changing its position? Or do you want the image to zoom and change the position so that the point you clicked on becomes the center of your view? This is purely a matter of personal preference. To the right, there's a checkbox to override font smoothing in Lightroom. By default, font smoothing is used in Lightroom, but you can also force Lightroom to use your operating system settings when it comes to font smoothing. The only real reason to turn this option on is if you want to ensure that your fonts look consistent across all applications. The settings on the interface tab of the Preferences dialog are obviously a matter of personal preference, but after reviewing the options available to you, there's a good chance you'll want to make a few adjustments to improve your experience in Lightroom. Lightroom uses catalog files to store the information about your images and the adjustments you apply to them, and establishing appropriate settings for your catalogs is an important part of managing your images. The Catalog Settings dialog is accessible in two places. You can access it from the General tab in the Preferences dialog box by clicking Go to Catalog Settings. You can also go directly to the catalog settings by choosing Edit Catalog Settings on Windows or Lightroom Catalog Settings on Macintosh. The General tab of the Catalog Settings dialog box is mostly about presenting you with some information about your catalog. You can see where it's stored, the file name, when it was created, when it was last backed up or optimized, and how much space it's taking up on your hard drive. You can also click the Show button to bring up a window in your operating system that shows you the location of the Lightroom catalog files. In addition to the information that's presented here, you also have an option to set how frequently Lightroom will back up the catalog files. Notice that as of Lightroom 3, the option is to back up upon exiting Lightroom, not when Lightroom starts. You can specify once a month, once a week, once a day, every time you exit, or only the next time you exit Lightroom. Naturally, it's a good idea to back up your catalogs on a regular basis. How often is necessary depends in large part on how quickly you're adding files to the Lightroom catalog. In most cases, once a week is probably fine, but if you're adding images to Lightroom on a very regular basis, you might want to choose daily. Also keep in mind that these options only cause Lightroom to back up automatically when you actually exit Lightroom. If you never close Lightroom, an automatic backup will never be performed. The next tab is File Handling. As the name implies, this contains settings related to the handling of files related specifically to the catalog that you have open in Lightroom. The Preview Cache section, of course, relates to the previews that are generated and stored inside of the catalog for all of the images being managed within that catalog. The standard preview size determines what size previews will be generated. These numbers relate to typical monitor resolutions, and you should ideally use a setting that's as close as possible to the native resolution of your display. Preview quality relates to how much compression will be applied to those previews. High quality means minimal compression, low quality means maximum compression, and of course medium is a good balance between file size and image quality. We generally leave this set to the medium setting. The final setting for Preview Cache is when to discard the one-to-one previews, in other words the full-size previews that are generated whenever you zoom into an image. By default, these previews will be discarded after 30 days. What you need to consider here is how frequently will you be going back to existing images and needing to be zooming in. If you only need to critically evaluate images once and then really don't come back to them all that often, then you might want to choose the after 1 day option in order to help minimize the size of your catalog. If you go back to your images on a more regular basis, you might want to choose the after 1 week or even after 30 days option. In an extreme case, you might even want to choose never, although it's important to keep in mind that this can cause your catalog to grow quite significantly. For most users, the after 30 days setting is probably appropriate. The import sequence numbers section contains numbers that for most users never change from the number 1. These numbers will only change if you use sequence numbers as part of a file naming template when you import images into Lightroom. The only reason you would need to come back and change these is if you had a problem importing certain images and you need to re-import them and want to reset these numbers to a particular value. The first checkbox relates to whether or not suggestions will be presented as you type values into metadata fields. In most cases, this is very helpful. Of course, for most users, this would be considered a good thing, something that will benefit you in terms of data entry for your images. As a result, we generally leave this option turned on. To the right, there's the Clear All Suggestion List button. As the name implies, if you click this button, all of those suggestion lists will be cleared. The next checkbox determines whether developed settings, in other words, the adjustments you applied to images, will be saved inside the metadata for your JPEG, TIFF, and PSD files. In other words, do you only want developed settings to be stored within the catalog or also pushed out to the JPEG, TIFF, and PSD files? While there's a good chance you're working primarily with raw captures, we do recommend leaving this option turned on, so any information about adjustments for these file types will be embedded within those actual images. The next option is similar, but it relates specifically to raw captures. It determines whether information about changes you apply to your raw captures will be written to the XMP sidecar file that stores information about that raw capture. The reason this option is turned off by default is that if it were turned on, every time you apply an adjustment to an image, the XMP file associated with the raw capture would need to be updated. This increases the risk of corruption for that XMP sidecar file, and it also means that your hard drive is going to be much more active while you're applying adjustments in Lightroom. We generally recommend leaving this option turned off, but keep in mind if you leave this option turned off, it is your responsibility to make sure that you save any changes out to the original file. Otherwise, changes you make in Lightroom, such as adding keywords, will not be visible to other applications. Finally, we have a checkbox that allows you to determine whether or not date or time changes will be written back into your original raw captures. This is a little bit of a controversial issue. You might expect that, of course, if you apply a change to the capture date or time for an image, that would automatically be written out to the original capture. However, many photographers are concerned at the notion of their original raw captures being touched in any way. As a result, you need to make a decision for this setting whether it's more important that date and time changes be reflected in your original capture or whether you want to leave those original raw captures untouched to the extent possible. It is important to keep in mind that the catalog settings relate to the currently opened catalog. In other words, you can use different settings for each individual catalog you create. It is therefore important to open each catalog individually and review the catalog settings for each of them. When you're finished establishing settings for the current catalog, you can move on to additional catalogs, opening them and adjusting the catalog settings as needed. In each case, when you're finished adjusting your catalog settings, you can simply click OK. Many photographers dismiss as silly the ability to customize the identity plate in Lightroom. While it might seem like an unimportant option for customizing one element of the Lightroom interface, it can actually be a very nice touch if you use Lightroom to present images to clients. The identity plate is the top panel in Lightroom, and in particular, the left side that by default includes the Adobe Photoshop Lightroom branding. You can completely customize this identity plate to your own liking, which I'll show you how to do in this video. By the way, keep in mind that the identity plate is used in the output modules of Lightroom, allowing you to place your name or logo along with images shared via the slideshow, print, or web modules. To adjust the identity plate, we'll choose Edit Identity Plate Setup from the menu. On the Macintosh, this would be Lightroom Identity Plate Setup. If you want to use a custom identity plate, the first thing you'll need to do is turn on the Enable Identity Plate checkbox at the top left of the Identity Plate Editor dialog. This will replace the existing identity plate with whatever you define here in the dialog. The default is to use stylized text. In other words, text that you can customize in terms of the font attributes. So I can simply type in something such as Tim Gray Photography, and this will replace the existing identity plate. I can then select the text and change the font, for example, to anything else I'd like to use, change the font attributes such as bold versus italic, adjust the font size to my liking, and change the font color if I'd like to. Even better, I can use a graphical identity plate. To get started, choose the Use a Graphical Identity Plate option, and then click Locate File or drag an image directly into the space provided here. I'll go ahead and click Locate File and then select an identity plate that I've created. As you can see, that identity plate is automatically reflected in the Lightroom interface. I can change the image at any time by simply clicking Locate File and choosing a new image, or click Clear Image if I want to get rid of the identity plate image altogether. In addition, you can adjust the font attributes for the module picker at the top right of the Lightroom interface. Similar to the options for choosing stylized text for the identity plate, you can simply adjust the font itself or the various attributes for that font. The two colors available relate to which module is currently active, the color on the left, in this case white, and which modules are currently not in use, the gray shown on the right. You can change either of these colors simply by clicking on the color swatch and choosing a new color. Once you're happy with your identity plate settings, you can save them so they'll be readily available in the future should you ever change the settings. Simply click on the pop-up at the top left of the Identity Plate Editor dialog and click Save As. You can then provide a name, I'll type V2B for Video to Brain here, and click Save. That identity plate will then be accessible directly from this pop-up. If at any time you decide you want to get rid of it, simply click the pop-up again and choose Remove. By the way, it's also possible to reduce the size of the Identity Plate Editor dialog by clicking Hide Details. This button will actually cause only the settings for the module picker over on the right-hand side to be hidden from view. Once you're finished adjusting the settings for your identity plate, you can simply click OK. Besides being a fun way to customize the Lightroom interface, a personalized identity plate is also a great way to reinforce your brand when sharing images with others using Lightroom. The concept of presets and templates is very important in Lightroom. For many photographers, the concept of using the same settings for multiple images might not seem like a good idea. But in actual practice, there are many situations where you want to apply the same look to multiple images, and even more situations where you want to use the same layout for sharing your images via slideshows, prints, and web galleries. There are a variety of situations where you'll presets and templates to use in Lightroom. In this lesson, I just want to give you an overview of the concepts involved so you can better appreciate why these features are so important. You might look at the implementation of presets and templates and feel they're exactly the same thing. They are indeed similar by virtue of the fact that both are storing settings to be used at various stages of your workflow. The difference is that presets store information about how adjustments should be applied to images, and templates store information about presentation layout for one or more images. A subtle distinction perhaps, one that is helpful to understand. It is probably easiest to get a sense of presets and templates by taking a look at the presets that are available in the Develop module. I'll switch to the Develop module so that we can take a look at some of the presets that are available. In some cases, a preset is used because you want a consistent look and feel for a series of images. In other cases, a preset is simply used to explore possibilities in how you might interpret a given image. Regardless of how you utilize presets in your own workflow, they can save you a considerable amount of time compared to adjusting individual settings for every single image. As you can see, when I move to the left panel and put my mouse over one of the presets, the navigator shows me a preview of the effect that would be applied to the image if I clicked on that preset. I can move down through the list and see the various effects that are available. In this case, I'm going to hide the navigator so that we can see more of the presets at one time. As a result, to see the effect, I'll have to actually apply the preset by clicking it so that the preview image here is updated. I'll just click on any of my presets here so that we can see that they are indeed applying a different look and feel to the image as I progress down the list. Besides the numerous black and white filters you see here, there are also a variety of color filters, creative filters, edge effects, a number of ways we can interpret the image using Lightroom. All of this is made possible by the use of presets. We're able to simply click and choose from a variety of settings in order to produce the final effect. And of course, the preset doesn't need to be the final effect. With any of these presets, I can then go over to the right panel and fine-tune the particular settings that were used as desired. The concept of templates is very similar to presets. The difference is that templates relate to output layouts as opposed to the adjustments we apply to the image. So for example, I can go to the slideshow module to explore some of the templates that are available. In this case, I have a series of images that could be included in my slideshow, and I can choose the layout that I want to use for this particular slideshow. By clicking on the name of the particular template, I can see a preview that gives me some sense of what to expect in the final output. The same would hold true for the print and for the web modules. I can choose images and then choose a template that will be applied for those images. In the case of the print module, that would mean, for example, potentially printing images at a particular size or printing multiple images on the same page. For the web module, that would mean creating web galleries that include a variety of different images. In addition to those that are included with Lightroom, you can create your own presets and templates. All you need to do is configure the settings on the right panel as desired, whether that means adjustments in the Develop module, a particular layout for a slideshow, printed output, or a web gallery. Once you have the settings established, you can simply click the plus symbol to create a new preset or template depending on which module you're working in. You can then provide a name for that template so that you can choose it from the list. In this case, I'll just call this a general web gallery so that I have something saved, and I'll click the Create button. Notice that by default, any templates that I add are going to be added to a section of User Templates down at the bottom of the list of available templates. This is where I would go to apply any of the user presets or templates that I've created in any of the modules. As you've seen in this lesson, presets and templates are used throughout Lightroom, so it is important to understand the concepts involved so you can better put them to use to create the most efficient workflow possible. As much as working with Lightroom requires that you be able to manipulate a variety of controls, it is also important to keep in mind that working in Lightroom is first and foremost about working with your photographic images. To really put your images at the forefront, you'll want to understand how to work with the panels and the lights out view. How you work with panels depends not only on your own personal preferences, but also on the particular task you're working on. Let's take a look at how panels work first. In Lightroom, there are essentially 4 panels. There's the left panel, which contains your more general settings, and the right panel, which contains your more specific adjustments. There's also the top panel, which contains the module picker, and the bottom panel, which is the film strip. All of these panels can individually be hidden or revealed. For example, once you've navigated to the module that you want to work with, there's a good chance you'll spend a fair amount of time in that module. So for example, once I get to the Develop module, I'm not going to need to change modules for a while, so I could click on the arrow at the top center of this panel to hide it from view. Notice that I still have a stub that I can access, and by default, when I mouse over that stub, the panel will be revealed again. Mousing away from that panel will cause it once again to be hidden. And if I click on the stub, the panel will remain in place. This behavior is consistent for all of the panels. So for example, I could hide the film strip if I don't need to switch between images right away. I can also hide the left panel and the right panel as desired. You'll notice that the top panel right now has a solid arrow, while the panels at the left, right, and bottom have a dotted arrow. The solid arrow indicates that mousing over or away from the panel will not change its behavior. It's fixed in place. The dotted arrow indicates that mousing over that panel or away from it will cause it to be revealed or hidden again. You can also change the behavior of the panels in terms of when they will be hidden versus revealed. To access these adjustments, simply right-click on any of the panels. In this case, I've right-clicked on the right panel, and so I'll see the pop-up that relates specifically to this panel. I can choose to auto-hide and show, which means the panel will be hidden or shown depending on my click behavior. When I click to hide the panel, mousing over it will cause it to be revealed again, and mousing away will cause it to be hidden again. But if I click again, the panel will be fixed in place and will not hide again unless I click one more time. I can also set the option to only auto-hide. What that means is if I move my mouse away from the panel, it will be hidden. But if I move my mouse back over the panel, it will not be revealed. I have to click on the stub for the panel in order to reveal it again. This can be helpful for situations where you mostly don't want the panel to be visible, and you want to make a conscious decision about when the panel should be viewed, rather than having it pop up when you inadvertently move your mouse over the stub at the edge of the Lightroom interface. You can also choose the manual option. With manual selected, the panel will never automatically hide or be revealed again. You always must click in order to hide or reveal the panel. An additional option is to synchronize this panel with the opposite panel. In other words, the left and right panels will behave in unison, and the top and bottom panels will behave in unison. I'll turn on this option and then also set them both to auto hide and show. Notice now if I hide the right panel, the left panel is also hidden. But if I mouse over the right panel, only the right panel is revealed. The left panel will not be revealed. In other words, the panels are hidden whenever I move away from one of the panels, but when I mouse over the stub for a panel, only that panel is revealed. However, if I click on the stub for a panel, the opposite panel will still be revealed. I'm now going to set all of the panels to be revealed so that I can show you some keyboard shortcuts related to hiding panels as well. If I press the Tab key, the left and right panels will be hidden. Pressing Tab again will cause them to be revealed. If I add the Shift key, in other words, pressing Shift and Tab at the same time, then all four of the panels will be hidden or revealed. As you can imagine, hiding all of the panels can be very helpful for seeing the entire image. To take this a step further, we can also hide the toolbar below the preview image by pressing the letter T on the keyboard. Taking this even further, we can take advantage of Lights Out view. Now, the Lights Out view works regardless of where I am in Lightroom and also works regardless of the particular panel configuration. But it makes the most sense to use the Lights Out view when you're viewing the image as large as possible. To access Lights Out view, we'll press the letter L on the keyboard. The first step is what's called the dim view. In the dim view, you can still see the Lightroom interface in the background. At the moment, that consists primarily of the title bar and the menu bar since I've hidden all the panels. If I press the L key one more time, then I'll go into full Lights Out view, where the entire screen is black by default and I can only see the image itself. Pressing L one more time will take me back to the normal Lightroom interface. I can then bring the panels back with a Shift tab in this case and reveal the toolbar by pressing the letter T one more time. Another useful option for changing the display within Lightroom are the screen modes found under Window Screen Mode. These include the normal screen mode, which is what we would typically be accustomed to in Lightroom, where we have the title bar and a menu bar. We can also go into full screen mode without the title bar, but with the menu bar, or full screen mode without the title bar or the menu bar. There's also an option to go to full screen mode and at the same time hide the panels, or we can choose the next available screen mode, which is really more of a placeholder for the shortcut key, the letter F. In most cases, I think of these options as purely being a matter of preference, and so I would tend to press F to toggle through the screen modes, first by hiding the title bar, then by hiding the menu bar as well. While this doesn't cause a significant impact in terms of how much space is available for the Lightroom interface, it is helpful if for no other reason than it removes additional distractions. The only caveat in this case, of course, is that we no longer have the menu readily available. But we can simply press F one more time to get back to one of the other screen modes, either with the title bar or merely with the menu bar. And of course, keep in mind that we can always choose Window, Screen Mode, Full Screen and Hide panels, which uses a keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-F on Windows or Command-Shift-F on the Mac. By using that keyboard shortcut, we can switch to the full screen mode where the panels are hidden as well as the title bar and the menu bar so that we're able to focus on the image. And naturally, you could take this a step further by adding the Lights Out display to really focus on only the image. Once you've gone into full screen mode with the panels hidden, you can press F to return back to normal mode and Shift Tab to bring back the panels.